Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, Brisbane's 3-day lockdown ends after no unlinked cases of community transmission.
That is good news for Queensland, and Easter is good to go.
Another target missed. The federal government reaches the end of March with just half of the nation's aged care residents vaccinated. And Big Brother is watching, but that's okay. New research suggests Australians would like QR codes and contact tracing to continue indefinitely. Just stick a chip in my arm. Joining me on the panel, journalist with The Monthly, Lek Blaine. Lovely to meet you, Lek.
Lovely to meet you too.
Director of government relations firm Chikarovsky and Associates and former New South Wales Liberal leader Kerry Chikarovsky. Always great to see you.
Always a pleasure to be here.
CEO of the Tourism and Transport Forum, Margie Osmond. How are you, Margie? You're looking better than you have any right to.
Yes, I don't think this has been one of the best weeks for the industry, but lovely to see you, Ellen.
Indeed. And in Adelaide, Regional Programs Coordinator of the APY Arts Collective and Uluru Statement Leader, Sally Scales. Always great to spend an evening with you, Sally. G'day.
Hiya.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're on Facebook. It's an Easter miracle, or perhaps just a rigid adherence to the rules of a 3-day lockdown. Either way, restrictions are being lifted in Greater Brisbane just in time to enjoy the holidays.
We only had one community-acquired case overnight in Queensland, and that was the perfect case, if I could describe it as that. This was one of those participants in that party that happened at Byron Bay. So when the person came back to Queensland, they went into quarantine and they were tested on Monday night, and they were negative on Monday night. Then they were tested again Wednesday morning when they were positive. So they have been in quarantine during their infectious period.
So for the next 2 weeks, from 12 noon today until Thursday the 15th of April, all Queenslanders will be required to carry a mask when they leave their home. We will also ask you to wear those masks in indoor spaces such as shopping centres and supermarkets, indoor workplaces, public transport.
This couldn't have come at a better time for Queensland's struggling tourism sector, which will be relying on revenue coming in over the Easter period. From today, the government's $1.2 billion aviation package comes online, with thousands of cut-price airfares going on sale. But a group of Queensland politicians believes the program has been fatally compromised by this most recent outbreak.
Confidence was just coming back, and yet again we're being locked down. There's no point coughing up more money if borders are going to shut. The timing is shocking. We're heading into Easter and people will lose confidence. The $1.2 billion stimulus would have been a great opportunity to get tourism back on its feet, and now the other states will make hay while Queensland suffers.
Well, remember that while Brisbane is open, Western Australia remains closed to all of Queensland, and South Australia and Tasmania still have restrictions on anyone coming from Brisbane. The General Manager of Beach Road Holiday Homes in Noosa, Joanne Dillon, says many guests have been calling uncertain of whether their holidays can go ahead.
When Anastasia announced that the lockdown was over, there was, we all got, see, I'm even getting emotional in my voice, you know, we were just like, oh, thank God. And I got teary because it impacted so many of our guests and our owners. We've been dealing all week with a lot of fear from guests that have booked in. We've had guests that are clambering for accommodation earlier this week because they didn't want to go back to Brisbane. We had guests wanting to see if they could lock down up here. We've had a couple of cancellations from interstate, mainly South Australia, because they would have to quarantine when they went back to South Australia. And then we've had a couple of Sydney-siders unsure and panicked. So we've had to sort of almost counsel them and look, let's just wait and see what happens. This last case isn't so bad. The fact that it's open was just elation. So we had a bit of a little jump around and celebration, and that was, yeah, it was fantastic.
Margie, I can't work out with Brisbane now reopened whether or not Easter's been saved in the nick of time or whether or not this is a bit of a catastrophe for the tourism sector.
Yeah. Well, look, I have to be honest and say I've been saved in the nick of time because I've been in lockdown this week because I was in Brisbane last Wednesday.
Right.
So
you got out and into
I'm
the
very
studio.
glad to be here tonight. But look, I think I'd like to say I hope it's going to be as robust an Easter as we would normally have hoped. But I think part of the issue for me is Queensland's open for business now. If you've got tickets and you've got bookings, you go. Get out there and spend some time and spend some money and have a terrific time. But the issue for us is we surveyed a couple of weeks ago nationally, and 2/3 of people at that stage told us that they were not going anywhere for Easter and that they were very reluctant, in fact, to travel over the next 12 months. And that is all about borders. It is not about the virus per se. In fact, when you look at the list of reasons why people are choosing not to travel or are uncertain or have lost confidence, the top 4 or 5 reasons on the list are all related to borders and the lack of any kind of consensus or certainty around what may, will, won't happen.
So that was a survey of 1,000 people. It was before the flooding rains on the east coast. It was before this latest COVID outbreak in Brisbane, and even with, you know, they weren't border closures. Well, they have been border closures, Western Australia, and all these restrictions around the Queensland outbreak. It was before all of that.
Yep, absolutely.
And still 2/3 of people are saying not going nowhere.
Yeah. And it is this confidence issue. And I think, you know, this is why things like the stimulus package around the aviation is a good idea. It gets people thinking about travelling and perhaps feeling a bit more confident. I mean, we might take issue with what the destinations were and that could have been a different list, and hopefully will be, because the government says that it's open to discussing that. But I think it is a mistake to underestimate just what an impact this has on people. And it's not just about the holiday. If I go away, will I be locked down while I'm there? Might I have to quarantine when I come home? The extra angle on that now is that if I go away for the holiday and I can come home and that's okay, but what about if I have to for work travel somewhere and I can't go because that state's made a decision to close against this other state? We are way past this being an acceptable outcome. It is now time for some leadership to bring this thing back together again. A single approach is what we absolutely have to have.
Let me just poll Sally before we move on. Sally, you were you wear many different hats with the APY galleries. There's a gallery up here in Sydney, and there's a gallery in Adelaide. You were travelling a lot as chair of APY Lands. You've been involved with the Uluru Statement. That involved a lot of travel as well. How are you feeling about, and later in the show we're going to talk about, you've got your own art exhibition opening at the APY Gallery in Adelaide, and presumably everybody, including me, wants to go. Are people confident? Are you confident to leave Adelaide, and people confident to come to your opening?
I think it's a confidence thing, but it's also a risk that people have to make themselves, whether or not they want to travel. I mean, you know, as a South Australians, I would actually say stay here or come to South Australia and see our beautiful beaches and, you know, wineries and things like that. You know, it's about people also going and seeing their own backyard. You know, Tourism Australia's whole campaign is about seeing what's in our own country, and, you know, whether that is within your own state. Everyone loves to escape the winter months of the south, go up north, but, you know, there's so much beauty here in South Australia and in Central Australia. But for me, I think there's conversations around that as well, with JobKeeper finishing up, or whether people can actually afford to travel, whether that's something that isn't a luxury they even have anymore, and that coming into play. For me, it's a choice by choice. If I'm flying with a family or with Walter, for example, is that a better outcome if there is a border crossing, or am I okay going for a work trip and it's just me? Yeah, that's fine with me.
But you wouldn't take 5-year-old Walter with you at this point for fear of having to spend 2 weeks in a hotel with him?
Yeah, but also South Australia's, yeah, exactly. And also South Australia's got great beaches and wineries, so I'm not complaining at all. So it's about we know our regional communities need support. We know that there's so much more than just the beaches that we have. It's about getting out there and having a look there. And I think I think people have forgotten a good old road trip as well. Great for aviation, but look, you know, mum and pop towns and country towns are really important to the heartbeat of our country. So.
Yeah.
Well, Ellen, if I can just add there too, that off the back of this surveying of ours, we also know that the 63% of people who didn't want to travel, of those who were going to travel, the vast bulk of them were going to do it either in the capital city or the regional areas of their own state. So I do think that the rebirth of the road trip is part of our ongoing future now, and people feel so much safer travelling in their own backyard.
Kerry?
Well, as someone who flew to Adelaide before Christmas and spent a glorious 4 hours in an airless room, because when I got there they told me I couldn't stay. Or I could stay, but I had to go into 14 days quarantine.
Did you come straight home?
4 hours later I got on the plane and came back again. And they literally changed the rules at 11:30 on the Saturday night. I was on a 9 o'clock flight and didn't bother to check, of course. Anyway, but having said that, I can understand why people might be reluctant, right? I do actually understand it. To your point, Margie, I can understand that people go, oh, I don't want that to happen to me. Having said that, I've been on a plane a lot recently. I've been to Melbourne, Canberra, Brisbane, Adelaide, because I hope that we can just get life back to normal as quickly as possible. And that means to have enough confidence that the next time that happens to me, I might get 24 hours notice and not just the time that I got the last time. But I just think we've got to say, look, you know, we have to accept that there's going to be difficulties with travel, hopefully not border closures. I actually think that's probably the worst thing that can happen to not only the Australian tourism industry, but to all our levels of confidence. So, you know, again, you've heard me say this before, all power to Gladys Berejiklian and saying, let's keep the borders open. I think she's doing a great job here, and I just hope that other premiers will take notice of her very strong leadership.
Lek, I love this fact about you, that when your darling father died, he left you and your brothers and sister a motel in Bundaberg.
Yes.
Which is a very interesting thing, because then as a writer, it was like one of those social experiments. How will the writer, the creative type, go with the Bundaberg Motel? How are they doing up there at the moment?
Yeah, it was. He had a great sense of humour, Dad, and and that was probably his greatest prank of all, was bequeathing a motel to all of us, because it's an interesting way of life, running a motel.
How did you go with it?
Well, my brother Steve ran it initially. He'd had a lot of experience in business. He's 9 years older than me. My brother John ran it after that for 3 years with his partner. He's 8 years older than me. He's also 110 kilo, former prop forward. I'm not 110 kilos. I'm not a former prop forward. I don't strike fear in anyone's heart. So yeah, it was. I was getting asked a lot where my parents were when I was.
Oh no.
And usually there'd be some quite hairy conversations because they didn't quite believe that I was actually the proprietor of the motel. So
I heard you once describe that it looked like one of those secret camera operations where you were waiting for Aston Kutcher to jump out and say, "Hey, you've been pranked."
Yeah. No, it was a very colourful way of life, and yeah, there was lots of good parts of it, lots of great people that I met, and yeah, it'll make great material one day.
For the writer.
Do you still own it?
No. So yeah, sold it. We sold it at the end of 2018. So
Probably good timing.
yeah.
Well done.
So the guy who took over, there was obviously a lot of fear when COVID first happened, and he's and yeah, it was a really tough few months for Bundaberg and for like right around the country. But then I think Queensland had such a resilience, and regional Queensland did pretty well coming out of it. And for a lot of local motels in Bundaberg, they're actually busier over the summer months than what they were the previous summer. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot of uncertainty, but there's also a lot of robustness and a lot of it's becoming a lot easier to adjust to these sort of short-term shocks because we've sort of been through them before.
And when you called up today to say how you're going in order to report to us here on the television show, what did they say?
I called up my brother first and asked him about it. He's a car salesman in Bundaberg, and he said, "What are you talking?" It's water off a duck's back. Yeah, it's a storm in a teacup sort of response, which is weird because I live in Bondi Junction, so I was right in the thick of the very original lockdown, and yeah, it was like we were living in parallel universes, like this, completely adrift from each other, because the reality of living in Bundaberg was just so different to the reality of living in Sydney during lockdown. Like it just didn't occur. in the same way in those areas.
Margie, can I ask you, I went back to a speech the Prime Minister gave in late March 2020, which feels like some years ago now, and he was talking about the bridge that he wanted to build. Hang on, I'll just pull it up on my phone. He said, "Our focus is on cushioning the blow and providing hope to every Australian that we will come through this and we'll get to the other side. We know this will be temporary. That's why all our actions are geared towards building a bridge, keeping people in work, enhancing the safety net for those who aren't, and keeping businesses alive so they can get to the other side and stand up their workforces as quick as possible." Has that bridge got tourism to the other side?
Well, look, I think it was a fine sentiment, and nobody could be happier about having had JobKeeper than the tourism industry. Unfortunately, we've been unsuccessful in convincing the government that there was a need to continue it. And I genuinely do think that there is a whole portion of the industry that's disenfranchised, and they're that part of the industry that are mainly internationally exposed. And some of those businesses are 60-70% affected by not having international tourists. I mean, even things, Ellen, like the attractions marketplace. You think of all those iconic attractions around the country that you probably went to as a child or you've taken your kids to. They're struggling very, very much because traditionally when Australians travel, they kind of go and lie on a beach or go and lie by the pool. It's actually a real effort, and that's why you're seeing so many of these voucher schemes to try and get people into different experiences and getting them out and about. But it is an uphill battle, and it's one of the reasons why domestic will never replace the international.
Just not enough bodies, right?
No, and they're not spending enough. So your average international person would spend 3 times as much as a local. Doesn't mean not everybody's not trying as hard as they can to make this work, but you know, you can only stretch this rubber band so far, and it won't fill the gap for those internationally exposed businesses. So there is going to have to be some additional ongoing support. The government's proposed low interest loans, but being really honest, you know, nobody's going to extend their debt at this point in time, and it is going to need some direct intervention.
And so these months between now and the budget will certainly tell.
Yes,
so
they
Sally,
will.
that's the question that I wanted to come from your perspective on. I mean, I was reading up on some things that you talked about when you took a leadership position at such a young age on the APY Lands executive board. You talked about at the age of 12 essentially being tapped on the shoulder and saying you've got the personality and the drive and the heritage and the understanding of culture and all the rest of it to be a leader. How do you know when to quit?
Well, I mean, at 12, I was told I already had one foot in the grave as an non-Indigenous, an Indigenous person. So, well, as, looking at it on the levels of, we talk about in the Closing the Gap schemes on, the health of Aboriginal people compared to non-Indigenous communities. So it's all that, chronic health, which is a big part of COVID, the fact that a lot of Aboriginal people are at risk, so I'm not going to be travelling until there's herd
immunity,
immunity around the vaccinations and stuff, and so the risks for my elders and also for Aboriginal businesses is that we go out on a limb. The galleries that my elders set up, everyone told us it wouldn't succeed. Everyone said no, it's not going to happen. That or look, if you come, especially if we come to Adelaide, we had people in our own sector saying, look, we're going to make sure you guys don't succeed. And my elders said, well, watch us. And so for us, that risk was there. But when you have that determinations of decades and centuries of knowledge and power and understanding, and also when you're coming from a place of disadvantage, everything goes, anything goes. And for us, we changed our market. We changed it to say our galleries are for young and emerging artists. We're giving them a platform. We're making sure that they have an income, that the community has an income. We are valuing artists as a true work and true places of financial independence. And that's what people forget. I mean, if it wasn't for artists, a lot of us wouldn't have survived COVID because we relied on whether it was literature, whether it was good music or the virtual tours, galleries and museums had, and all the incredible films and movies that we could go back and watch as well on all of the shows. But it's just that we survive through arts as well. And, you know, arts is a sector that is not well looked after in, you know, in the budget. It's actually not even our own portfolio. It's put in with other things. So we're quite often forgotten. But that's the risk. I think I think now as well, in the time of, we've had a year of COVID, it's around these companies and organisations about, you know, with it tourism, okay, how can we grow from this? It's 2021 now. How are we going to improve it? How are we going to incorporate First Nations communities in a meaningful way? How are we going to make sure that the conversations that are going on around leadership and lack of leadership in the ministers, prime ministers and whoever's, that you change that story so that you can come back fresh, excited and say, you know what, we're going to do it. We're going to do it our own way. Because that's what my elders did and they continue to do it. And I'm their voice.
Yes. Wonderful, wonderful answer. It's a wonderful message too about the need to evolve and change and continue to engage and persist as a small business owner, as you have with the APY galleries in Sydney and in Adelaide, which I'd encourage everybody to go to. I'd be at yours in Adelaide if I could this weekend. It's brilliant.
Next Thursday.
Next Thursday's your opening.
But I think, Ellen, it's also around the Uluru Statement. You know, the persistence of leadership is why the Uluru Statement is never going to die. You know, the Prime Ministers are wanting it to die, but we're never going to make it because we gifted it to the Australian people. And, you know, a lot of this stuff is about what does Australian people want? You know, how are we going to make ourselves and our communities and country better? You know, instead of looking up to the Prime Minister as the only leadership, look at each other as well. Look at our states and say, look, or even in our sectors, how can we change? If something's wrong, let's change it.
Wonderful to hear, Sally. Thank you for that. And I know Margie was drawing a lot from that in a difficult time. Difficult time, because so many people are asking that question in your sector. Should I just quit? Should I just quit, or should I throw more money at this because I don't know where the other side is? Yeah.
Look, it's an incredibly robust industry. It's about, you know, it's a rubber ball industry. It's always bounced back. This is the worst situation we've ever been in, and I think what makes it also unique is it's not just small businesses that are affected. It's every size of business. In fact, some of the places most affected are Sydney and Melbourne, because nobody's going there, despite some great campaigns which hopefully will change that. But the other thing is, what is the legacy? This is so right. You know, you can't look at this situation and go, the only thing I can worry about is survival. We actually have to think, what is the legacy? What is the good news? What is the change we could get out of this that will make the industry stronger, more sustainable, and make sure nobody ever takes us for granted ever again?
And representative of the heart of this country, right? Now, among the measures that are being kept in place in Queensland are restrictions on who can enter aged care facilities, with only end-of-life visitors allowed.
Unfortunately, they're necessary because only a third of aged care residents have been vaccinated and almost no aged care workers have been vaccinated so far. Similarly, very, very few residents of supported disability accommodation have been vaccinated, and for those reasons we need to maintain those lockdowns for 14 more days. I just underline again that we would not be facing risks like this if the Morrison government had engaged with us on the construction of a national quarantine facility.
Queensland's Deputy Premier was responding to news that only half of the nation's aged care residents have been vaccinated in the past 6 weeks. This falls well short of the government's original plan to have all residents and workers vaccinated by now. You'll remember that the federal government had previously abandoned their target of rolling out 4 million doses by the end of March. As things stand, about 700,000 doses have gone out so far. This morning, the Acting Chief Medical Officer, Michael Kidd, blamed the delays on failed deliveries of AstraZeneca's doses from overseas.
The projection of 4 million was revised weeks ago, and because it was very clear that we weren't going to be able to reach 4 million. Well, we are behind 3.2 million doses of AstraZeneca from overseas.
One thing is for sure, the government will be regretting ever mentioning the 4 million doses target.
this federal government has to accept responsibility for the foulings which are there. No one made Scott Morrison deliver the target of 4 million people being vaccinated by the end of March. It was Scott Morrison who chose to do that. It was Scott Morrison who said that he wasn't going to make promises that couldn't be kept.
For more on this, we're joined in Brisbane by infectious diseases physician and microbiologist at the University of Queensland, Paul Griffin. Hi, Paul.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Very good. Thanks for being here. I've seen a lot of people ask the questions I'm about to ask you, and I haven't seen anyone be able to give a clear answer. So why don't you take a shot at it? Are you ready?
Sure.
Nice big low underarm. You ready, Paul? Here it comes. We have the vaccines. We have state health systems and a GP network. What is the problem? There's an adjective before problem, but I left it out.
Look, it's a great question, and I think the priority now shouldn't be on whose fault it is that we're in this position, but just working together to try and get us out of it.
Everybody says that. Everybody says that. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have heard this interview conducted by better interviewers than me. What is the adjective problem?
Look, I think we've been too afraid of making a mistake, to be honest, and so we've overcomplicated this. I think people are really worried about giving a vaccine and there being perceived problems and then people getting blamed for those problems. So the thought was, well, let's go really slow and really cautiously. But the trouble is, I think that's underappreciating the risk of not rolling the vaccine out. And that risk is exactly what's come to fruition here in Brisbane over the last week or so. There's obviously very tangible consequences of having to have lockdowns and having to do all this contact tracing and all the measures we've seen. So that was a real risk, and I think we should have recognised that and just recognised that the risk of rolling out the vaccine was far less. It was something we could do. We do this really well every year with the flu vaccine. Other countries have done it well, and we just need to get moving on this vaccine.
Yeah, I think everybody agrees with that last sentiment. So who is so risk averse that they're not getting it out? Is it the people who are rolling up their sleeves? Is it the state governments? Is it the feds? What's the issue?
I think it's both. I think, we obviously saw a dosing error, for example, with the nursing home rollout, which I think added to everybody's concerns. And we've seen some adverse events in other countries that I think have had caused a lot of dialogue in the media and at the ground level that have also made people extra cautious with the vaccine. And even though we've got good evidence that those adverse events weren't necessarily linked to the vaccine, and there's been a lot of distracting commentary about which vaccine is better, for example. And, I think we need to go back to the basics, have faith in our regulator, the TGA, who are incredibly rigorous and certainly didn't rush the approval process. But who doesn't have that faith? See, that's what I don't understand, because I keep looking at the numbers, right? At the end of March 14, or March 10, let's say, Scott Morrison tweeted that there were 1.3 million doses of COVID in the country. Yippee-yi-yay, right? We've doled out 700,000, right? Then on March the 24th, CSL, used to be Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, what an amazing company. They are making AstraZeneca in Australia as quick as they can. So March 24, they put out a press release saying that they've released 830,000 locally made doses, right? And that they had another 2.5 million in cold storage. Let's forget about the 2.5 million. Let's just take the 830 and the 1.3 and let's call it, let's say 2 million, right? Bit over 2 million, 2.1 million doses. So originally, when you look at the graph that says this is what we're going to do, that was put out by the Health Minister, by week, where are we here, 29th, week 6, we were supposed to be at 1.7 million or something like that. We've got the doses. What's the problem? It's not about the internationals not sending it to us. We've got the doses. We could easily have done it. I agree. I think there's been some real limitations in getting those vaccines to the people who can give them out. We know a lot of GPs have been given a very small number of doses, such that it actually makes it not cost effective for a large number of them to actually operate these vaccine clinics. And we're yet to utilise our other colleagues that are so instrumental in our flu vaccine rollout, for example, our pharmacists. So, I think, again, because of extreme caution and extra regulation.
By whom?
Well, I think with allowing the GPs, for example, to come on board and the amount of supply that's going to those GPs, I think that's not been sufficient. I know a lot of GP clinics, for example, were given 50 doses in the first week, whereas they obviously had capacity to do many-fold more vaccines in that frame of time. And again, I think it was just because there was extreme caution. There was obviously lots of training that was required to be done that was perhaps a little excessive, but good, I guess, to see them do that. But then they were given a very small number of doses. And so, we could have obviously expanded the vaccine rollout very significantly by allowing them to have more of those doses early on. And as I say, to bring on the pharmacy colleagues as well, to get them vaccinating also. I think it's far beyond time to get them really ramped up so that we can have a collaborative approach and have as many avenues to getting the vaccine to people who want it as possible.
Kerry, this just feels like... I wore sequins because I just really wanted to sparkle up this conversation because I'm feeling like Sally. Sally's sitting there listening to this going, oh, we did the same thing, didn't we? Oh, it's got out of hotel quarantine. Yeah, we should learn those lessons. But let's not get into the blame game. Let's not get into the blame. OK, so we've been at this for a couple of months. Really? Really?
Well, I think it's probably a continuum from when we started. When we first started, when this first hit the country, no one knew what they were doing. Really. I mean, all governments... Doesn't matter what political persuasion, state or federal, they were learning as they were going.
I mean, yesterday when the Queenslanders were saying, oh, yeah, well, maybe we should... Actually, that's a good idea. Maybe we should vaccinate the people who are working in the COVID ward. And somebody else said, that's awesome. That is awesome. So let's go with that.
I think
and the rest of us are sitting here going, really?
Yeah, well, I think it's easy for us to sit here and be armchair critics. I think that really is, quite easy to do. Okay. I think the more difficult thing is, and to Paul's point, to be on the ground and trying to make sure that the vaccine gets delivered to the right people safely, and in conditions where it can be properly administered, which means people have to have some understanding of how to administer it. And I don't know, I'm not medical, I've got no idea, but I do understand that there needs to be some understanding of, when you give it and when the next dose gives and you give the next dose and all that sort of
stuff. Do you understand why Gladys is so frustrated? Because you look at these charts that we see in the newspapers, like the available doses in New South Wales, 190,000, 96 odd thousand have been done. You could similarly, Northern Territory, 13,000 doses, 7,000 have gone into arms. And a lot of those premiers and chief ministers are saying, well, if you kind of drop it off at the airport at 11 o'clock at night and say, quick, why haven't you administered the doses? You can't shout at us and tell us we've got a 50% rate of
And that goes to exactly to my point. That it goes exactly to the point I'm trying to make, which is, and I'm not making excuses for anyone, state or federal, I'm not making excuses for anyone, but goes to the point that this is a process, and I accept that we should have this better because we roll out flu vaccines, but we've been rolling out flu vaccines for, 20 years, I suppose, is it, Paul? I don't know how long we've had the flu vaccine, and everybody who's involved in that process knows, where they can get it, when they can get it, and who they have to, who they have to give it to. I think this one, because there has been a lot of publicity about it. I mean, Ellen, I've been listening to what's been happening in Europe. I mean, the EU should be taken out. Everybody in that EU should be dismissed because what they did was create this panic that AstraZeneca didn't work and it shouldn't go to certain people. And people who got it were all going to die anyway. I mean, they were going to die if they took the vaccine. So I think there's a level of panic that was created within our community as a consequence of what happened in Europe. And I think that you've got some people, particularly I'm told, and this is anecdotally, people from ethnic backgrounds who've got family in Europe are going, oh, don't have it. Oh, don't have it because, the EU are telling us it's a terrible thing to do. They've had to recant, as we know. Yeah. But, I mean, they did that for, quite a little while, Paul. I'm sure you've been following that that debate. And they did. They did for, several weeks. They're saying, oh, don't take it.
Paul, can I ask just one thing? Everyone says no blame game, but if we can't figure out why we've got sufficient doses and we can't get them into arms, then, presumably the problem will continue. Would transparency be part of the issue for the government to say, this is how many doses we've got, this is how many we've sent to New South Wales, Victoria, Western Australia, and then they could stand up and go, OK, this is going to be how we roll this out. We can't click our fingers with this. Would that assist?
Oh, clearly. I think there's certainly been missed opportunities to be open and transparent and to communicate freely between the different groups that are involved in this. I think there just hasn't been enough communication so that each side knows where the other stands. And as you say, to know when the vaccines are coming and how many so we can plan ahead and make sure they're used optimally. I think there's been, huge room for improvement on those fronts.
Good on you, Paul. Paul, you've been a great sport. Thank you very much for trying to answer the unanswerable questions. I won't put the rest of the panel through the politics of it, and we'll just look at my sequins and move on. Lovely to meet you. Paul Griffin is an infectious diseases physician at the University of Queensland and is free to roam around Brisbane in a mask, which is good news. We've all become used to whipping out our phone every time we walk into a cafe or public space, seeking out a QR code. But what if I told you that signing in would become the new normal? New research by Main Street Insights has found that 85% of us, 85%, want contact tracing to be a permanent part of the Australian landscape until everyone has been vaccinated against COVID-19. And a quarter of us want it to stay for good. Mark McCrindle talked us through his group's findings.
This data is showing that Australians aren't ready to throw off all of the restrictions and get back to life as we had it pre-COVID. Australians have recognised that COVID is with us for the foreseeable future, and the vaccination program is going to take some months, probably into next year. And Australians are saying, 4 in 5 of them are saying, let's not lift the restrictions, let's keep checking in, let's allow some of that tracking to take place until we are all vaccinated and until we have, beaten this COVID pathogen. We do think of Australians as being pretty tough and we can handle anything, but the sharpest sentiment we found in the last year has been anxious. That has been the feeling around COVID. It has rattled Australians. That's now shifted to hopeful as being the #1 sentiment, which is great. We feel we are on the way out of it. But that's why Australians want to keep some of these restrictions in place, because they do know that this thing can come back. But remember, Australians were locking themselves down before those health orders came into place. And even now, as restrictions are lifting, the government is having to give vouchers to travel and encourage people back to the CBDs because Australians aren't too convinced that we're over it. Australians have shown themselves to be very compliant through COVID, and that is contrary to what we think about as Australians. We think that we like to play our own way and can sort it out ourselves, but there has been very much a community mindedness, a listening to and responding to government directives, and an appreciation of how governments have led Australia through this challenge.
Look, I was interested to read that you're writing a quarterly essay forthcoming on the larrikin myth. And at the Sydney Writers' Festival, which you're part of as well, there's a wonderful talk that's called the larrikin myth. One of the enduring beliefs of Australian identity, says the blurb, is the idea that we as a nation embody the larrikin spirit, our population's easygoing, anti-establishment and laissez-faire, but arguably our success in responding to COVID-19 points to a different truth. Behind the she'll be right veneer, we are anxious, like obedient and state-regulated people. What do you reckon?
I think that that's absolutely true. I think that Australia historically has been a nation of wowsers cosplaying as larrikins, and a lot of our greatest propagators of this larrikin myth were themselves, such as Henry Lawson, themselves deeply anxious and insecure people. Right. And they propagated these myths to compensate for their insecurities. And we've arrived at a place where a lot of the things that we tell ourselves about who we are don't really align very closely with the actual reality.
Yeah. And so how did that happen, the distinction between the two of who we think we are and who we really are, lining up with our little QR codes and doing what we're told?
I think so many of our myths and so many of our national stories came from the bush and came from war, but the reality was that Australia's always been a fairly suburban, middle-class country, and so a lot of the stories that we're hearing about ourselves, it's the same way that Crocodile Dundee or Paul Hogan was held up as like a national
And we're
paragon.
happy to play along with that, aren't we, when we're overseas? We'll play along. That's not a knife. We'll do all that. But it's not so. But there are larrikins. Your old dad, you reckon, was a genuine larrikin.
Yeah.
Characteristics.
He was a flawed man in certain ways. He was a publican, but he's from a working class background. Dropped out of school at 13 and got a job at a meatworks, and and there's a lot of in between, but he ended up being a small business person. But he, he was very resentful of authority and very anti-establishment, and that wasn't just an instinct. That was about him being, thumbing his nose or taking the piss, or there was a deep reality behind that. He became a foster carer. He was a very politically engaged person, even though he didn't have like beyond a grade 8 education. He became very involved in the Labor Party at a local level, and so not to lionise the particular ideology of whatever he believed, but there was
anti-establishment, challenging the status quo, and then you put that layer of humour on top. So, so a couple of expressions from your old man that you'd say, righto, that's the full package, that's a larrikin. What would he say?
Oh, he just hated, like again, I don't want to get political, but he hated the monarchy. He hated anybody with heirs. He hated when I would put on airs, because I came from a completely different. I had a completely different life than him. I had it very easy compared to him. And so when I was in high school and I would regurgitate some of the philosophical ideas that I was reading on websites or in books, and he would, and I would use it as a way to belittle people who maybe didn't have access to those ideas or that education, and he was very, very quick to tell me to pull my head out of my ass, and in very politically incorrect language.
Sally, can I turn to you on this one? I mean, as we've said, you have said you are your elders' voice, but I guess being a larrikin, well, first of all, would you consider yourself a larrikin?
No, well, no, I think I come from resistance. I come from leadership. I come from strength, so that, this connection to country and, the country and culture and all of that sort of stuff. So really it's about, survival as well. It's resistance and survival. It's about, those stories of larrikins, from the bush. Well, we were surviving against them, we were making sure that we were still here and surviving and doing our own thing and making sure that our structures and networks were still existing. So, I think it's very much what the world sees as Australians is, the g'day mate, laid back sort of beach blonde, always surfing. It's like, I will never go in and surf. Like, I'm sorry, no, I'm a desert kid. I don't do surfing. So there's also, I think there's more than one facet of Australia, and I think it is about survival, it is about resistance, it is about the larrikin, it is about the mateship that tends to happen. It's also the fact that we throw up, we're a fair go country, it's like, yeah, for some. So I think that's the thing, there are some larrikins, there are some not. So yeah, but I think when it goes back to that QRing and all of that sort of stuff, at the end of the day, I think it's also about, we want to protect our own. We're very protective of our own space, of our community, of our family. So if it's doing a QR code, keep it going, because it's about viruses, but it's also about devastations, a flash flood, a fire, we don't have gun shootings like over in America, but it's about making sure if it was a case like that, we would be able to know who it is. So there's multi-layers of why the QR codes would actually be a good thing. Yeah.
Let me turn to you, Margie. I mean, I was sort of thinking about Sally's background, right? So 2017, she takes on these extraordinary challenges, takes on these risks, right? There's nothing kind of timid, anxious, obedient about Sally, right? She takes on the kinship of Walter. She takes on the chair of the APY lands. You look at Kerry Chikarovsky sitting here tonight, right? And in the mid-30s, in a wonderful book I looked up, Women Who Seize the Moment, we've got you ironing, Kerry, and burst into tears and say, I wanted to be the Premier. I wanted to be a politician. I said, well, bloody go and do it. So, you did. You got to be the leader of the opposition here. I mean, clearly you don't go down to Canberra and knock on doors on behalf of the tourism and transport operators unless, I don't know, you're willing to rock the boat, Margie.
Oh, look, I'm clearly a shy, retiring little flower, Ellen. I mean, look, I think it's really what Sally was saying before. You have to believe passionately in what you do. and that there is a reason for it and there is a reason why you're doing it. So, yeah, in that set of circumstances, there aren't any doors you should be afraid to knock on. I mean, I think, just going back to the QR code thing for a moment, I think one of the interesting things about that is it's almost an act of community now using the QR code. It's a bit like when COVID first started, I remember somebody said to me, when you look out on the empty streets, you should see it as an act of love because everybody's staying home to protect each other. And somehow the QR code to me feels the same now, and I think that's probably why there's such a huge level of support for it. People think they're contributing and helping each other by doing the QR piece. I'm a bit surprised how many of them think they want to keep doing it after COVID, but hey, so I think that's a really good thing. But, you know, I take your point about the leadership exercise. If there has to be something else that comes out of this terrible situation of COVID, I think lots of people have expressed themselves, found ways to help or found ways to make a point that they might not have done before. And that may just be one of the great legacies out of this exercise, people's willingness to explore and stand up for a whole range of ideas and issues. And can I just say one thing about the vaccination? Just one thing. The other thing that's interesting from our point of view, apart from the fact that it would be the saviour of the tourism industry having the vaccination done really well, you know, in the US and the UK, in a lot of instances when they get to the big end of the vaccination, you know, the big numbers, they're using big conference centres and stadiums and stuff. And that's one of the things that we're going to have to look at here. And I know the industry here is incredibly keen to help health by supplying venues with great refrigeration, loads of space and plenty of parking.
Yeah, so off you go, any football stadium in Australia. So that was a lovely conversation. Larrikin lie, bold resistance. And actually what we've discovered about ourselves is we're pretty keen on the collective good, which is pretty nice.
I'd really love to be described as a larrikin, but I don't think anybody has ever described me as a larrikin. Can't imagine anybody would.
Well, musicians, support crew and fans have slammed the decision to cancel this year's Byron Bay Blues Festival, which came just hours before the first gig. It's a kick in the guts for an industry brought to its knees by the pandemic. Interestingly, the festival was one of the few to have pandemic insurance when it was cancelled last year, and at the time, its director said he'd never be able to get it again. It's not bad news for everyone though. For instance, the Sydney Writers' Festival kicks off later this month, Lex part of that, and that's not to mention the hundreds of smaller musical events scheduled across the nation. So, Sally, we've arrived at the point of the discussion that I actually want to have tonight, which is good. There's got to be something in it for me.
We'll just go now and leave it to you and Sally, shall we?
That's it. No, leave your microphone on and do not move. Thursday, the 8th of April, APY Gallery. You're an artist.
Yeah, well, so I think that's the best thing that came out of COVID for me was towards the end of the year, when it started to slow down a bit with COVID, going, oh, I've got a little bit of time now, I don't have to, and so just getting into the studio with my mum and the elders here in Adelaide, and
we're seeing the pictures now of you, and these massive artworks. That's you and your mother, Josephine Mick, and you've got this joint exhibition at APY Gallery in Adelaide. I don't understand. I mean, I made bread.
I can't make bread. You made bread, I can't make bread. And a thing for me, you know, like I've been working with the artists since I was 15 and being around them, and also my beautiful grandma who passed away the day after International Women's Day. And, you know, she lived to, I think, 100. We don't know her particular birthday, but you know, she was the one that gave me the skills to do what I'm doing, always was forcing me down to paint with her. And, you know, I've had such great elders and artists around me. And so it's just been really a joy to get in there and paint, and doing it with my mum as well it's a lot of fun. So it's called Iririja, which means old, Koarija, which is new, which is me, and then Ngali, so it's and that means us, or the two of us. So it's the old and the new and the two of us. So it's a very much a generational story, and it's a remembrance for my grandma as well, because it's sort of got it's got some works on paper that she did, which is very, very special. So my mum did some works and I did some. So it's it's been a lot of fun. For me personally, the best thing that came out of COVID. Time.
Yeah. Absolutely, and that amazing tradition of your grandmother, Wawiria Burton, who was, I think, probably the oldest artist still practising in Australia, lived to a grand old age. Let me turn to you, Lek. Where are we with the arts in Australia in terms of, I mean, we saw last week there was a package of, you know, some funding to get some shows back on the road and so forth. I wonder whether we understand the significance of art to the cultural fabric of this country better or worse than we did 12 months ago.
I don't know. I think there's a great tension that goes right back through Australian history about our relationship with art. We both love it and consume so much of it, but we don't always
value it.
Value it, yeah, exactly. We like, and this is a running theme between the conversations that I would have with my dad, who, wasn't a consumer of art, and I definitely felt an anxiety about attaching myself to things because I would seem pretentious. So there is a tendency, I think we have to not want to take ourselves too seriously, even though, as I said before, I think that we in a lot of ways take ourselves very seriously. We just don't maybe allow ourselves to admit that publicly. We try to minimise our emotions, and that art is something that brings out great emotion, and we feel uncomfortable, a little bit uncomfortable about that, and that goes to the way that we perhaps treat art as an industry, and don't take it as seriously as we do small business. Or
you've written a book, a car crash, about a terrible car crash that you were involved in at the age of just 17, and you'll be talking a lot more about that when the book comes out, and I think Aussie Stories talking to you about that one as well. What did that experience teach you about the role of art, because you've written about it in ways that seem really hard to do, in talking through trauma and being part of whether it's collective trauma or an individual trauma?
Yeah, it was. So it actually came out on Tuesday. So
did it?
Yeah,
congratulations!
Oh, congratulations!
Yeah, I appreciate it.
You bought copies so that we can all
Where's
you
my
while
copy?
we're here.
I'm too uncomfortable. I'm too uncomfortable about carrying books around, and it's just been like overwhelming this week, especially like to go through the process of writing the book, which took 5 years, and the events, which took 12 years, happened 12 years ago. So. No, it was
scarifying events, right?
Yeah,
just
yeah.
Extraordinary that you're sitting here.
Yeah, or
given what you went through.
just an awful amount of trauma on a pretty wide scale, like beyond myself, and incredibly lucky in so many ways to be in the position that I am, even having this conversation. But yeah, the things that brought me back from the brink of despair and from the brink of grief was the little trivial seeming, art, listening to music and reading books, and the finding joy in completely mundane things on a regular basis. And that's, I didn't write the book as a way so much to that I would sum up or ever be able to articulate the grief and trauma of that event, but it was a way it came from the impulse of just wanting to create something and wanting to tell a story and share that with others and have their emotions validated and create conversations, and that's what amazing art does, and I hope that's what the book does. Yeah,
because such a traumatic event, and that horror of the young men in the car and the worst thing happens, it's what everybody fears for young men, and the way that opened up conversations between you all over the years that you could start to talk to each other as regional Queensland men. Just finally, Sally, just spend a minute talking to us about what are you and your mother painting? We got sound on Sally? No, we've lost sound on Sally. I suspect she's going to tell us she's painting a jukaba. Margie, we'll finish with you instead. You've long been such a supporter of artists and musicians across this country. Are you feeling optimistic for them despite Byron Bay?
Look, the Byron Bay closure is a tragedy, and I feel for them. It's just awful. But there are some great signs happening. I mean, I was lucky enough, very fortunate enough to be at the opening night of Hamilton last Saturday with an amazing Australian cast. But the international producer of Hamilton got up on stage and said, Sydney, and I think we should take this generically for the whole country, Sydney is the greatest city in the world because nowhere else could we be doing this. Well, you can in Melbourne, you can in Brisbane, you can do this in lots of places now. Australia is a shining light for some of those larger performing art mechanisms because we can do it. And while I think probably the festival marketplace is the one that's still going to be affected most because it's the hardest to sort of control and box, a lot of the other artistic activity has come back big time, and we really genuinely are the envy of the world. There should be 8 productions of Hamilton on round the world at the moment. There's one.
There's one.
And when Frozen opened, the head of production from Disney got up on stage and said, Australia is a miracle that you can do this here. So, you know, lots of, you know, things still to be fixed, but some really good news too.
Wonderful. Thank you all for coming in and enjoying this Thursday night with us. Thanks to Lex, to Kerry, to Margie and to Sally Sales. Good luck with the opening. Have a great Easter long weekend. Good night.
Right, Stu, Tingles, Probes, we're good? Let's get stuck in. Hello, Australia. I've got one thing I want to say to all the women out there watching right now, and that's this. The club is listening.
So does that mean...
Excuse me, I'm talking. We realise there are problems that need fixing, and that requires courage and leadership. That's why we've had a reshuffle of the entire playing roster, and I'm proud to announce a new appointment, the Prime Minister for Women, or a Captain for Women, if you will. Right, we've officially fixed our women problem. Thank you. I'll leave you in her hands. Good hustle.
Sorry. What is a captain for women?
It's very simple, Stu. ScoMo is Captain of Australia. Maurice Payne is Captain of Women.
Aren't women also part of Australia?
Just sorry, I didn't know the census was in town. Yes, Jen, technically women are part of Australia. That's why Maurice will be great. She's a woman and she'll make a great captain for women. So we've got the PM, and now we have the PMW.
But, Coach, isn't ScoMo also technically the Prime Minister for Women?
Stu, ScoMo doesn't hold